Emma had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but there was something about Black Hollow that made her uneasy. Perhaps it was the way the mist rolled in every evening, swallowing the town whole, or the strange silence that enveloped the streets when the sun set. It wasn't until she moved into her small, creaky cottage on the edge of town that she first heard the whispers. She would hear them late at night, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from the woods that lay just beyond her property line. She told herself it was nothing more than the wind, or perhaps the sound of old trees groaning under the pressure of age. But the whispers, they didn't sound like the wind. They sounded like voices. Emma had grown up in the city, and she was used to noise. But here in Black Hollow, the silence was suffocating, and the whispers felt like they were reaching out for her. Her curiosity got the better of her, and one foggy evening, she decided to take a walk into the woods. The moment she stepped past her gate, the whispers grew louder, like the voices were following her just out of reach. The woods were thick, the trees twisted, their limbs clawing at the sky as if trying to break free. As she ventured deeper, Emma came across an old stone path hidden under layers of moss. It was barely visible, but she followed it nonetheless, hoping it would lead her to the source of the whispers. After what felt like hours, the path ended abruptly at the edge of a large clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated house, the Hollow Manor. The mansion was a relic from another time, once grand, now crumbling, its windows shattered, and its roof caved in from years of neglect. Emma could feel a cold chill creep down her spine as she stared at the house, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She had heard the rumors about the place, the disappearances, the strange happenings, the people who had lived there and never been seen again. But Emma wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Still, there was something about the house that made her feel as though she wasn't alone. As she took a step toward it, she froze. In the distance, the faintest of shadows moved across the window. Someone, or something, was in there. The next morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing, with thoughts of the manor and the strange figure she had seen in the window. She decided to go to the town's small general store to clear her head and gather some groceries. As she entered, she was greeted by a woman with sharp eyes and a cautious smile. "You must be the new neighbor," the woman said, her voice friendly, but there was something guarded about her. "I'm Rachel. Welcome to Black Hollow." "Thank you," Emma replied, offering a small smile. "I'm Emma." Rachel studied her for a moment, then glanced over Emma's shoulder as if checking for someone else. "I've heard interesting things about you." Emma raised an eyebrow, confused. "Interesting things about me?" Rachel's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, nothing bad. Just that you're curious about the Hollow Manor." Emma's stomach sank. She had mentioned her walk in the woods to no one, let alone the fact that she had gone to the manor. "How do you know about that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and she glanced around nervously. "People here don't like to talk about it. They don't like to talk about the house or what happened there. You should be careful." "Careful?" Emma repeated. "Why?" Rachel leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because some things in Black Hollow are better left alone." Over the next few days, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the manor. The whispers were louder now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were calling to her. Despite Rachel's warning, Emma felt an irresistible pull toward the house. Late one night, after she had finished dinner, she made up her mind. She had to know more about Hollow Manor. She grabbed a flashlight, tucked it into her bag, and headed out into the woods once again. The house looked even more menacing in the dark, its broken windows like empty eyes, watching her every move. As Emma stepped inside, her breath hitched. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. But there was an overwhelming sense of something, like she wasn't alone. The whispers were louder now, but this time they weren't in the wind. They came from inside the house. Emma followed the sounds, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned a corner into what looked like a grand foyer, but it was decayed and decaying. Rotting tapestries hung from the walls, and the once majestic staircase now looked like it might collapse at any moment. Then she saw it, on the floor in the center of the room. A dusty old journal. Emma reached down, and as her fingers brushed against the leather cover, a cold gust of wind slammed a door shut behind her. She jumped, but didn't turn away. She had to know what was inside. Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the journal, the leather cover cold to the touch. The room felt impossibly still, but the air around her was charged with a strange energy, as if the house itself was alive, waiting for something. The journal was old, its pages yellowed, brittle and worn with time. A name was embossed in the center of the cover, faint but readable: Margaret Holloway. She hesitated for a moment, her curiosity battling her better judgment. Something about the name sent a shiver through her, but she couldn't explain why. Without thinking, she opened the first page, scanning the messy handwriting inside. October 15th, 1924. Father has told me to keep a record of everything. He says it will help with what is to come. I don't know what he means, but something is wrong with this house. There are things in the walls, whispers in the dark. I hear them every night. Sometimes they sound like the wind, but other times they sound like voices. I don't know who they are. I'm scared and Father doesn't listen. Mother says I should stay in my room at night, but I can't. I have to know. I have to know what's in the dark. Emma's throat tightened as she read those words. They felt too familiar, too close to the strange events she'd been experiencing herself. She turned the page, feeling a growing sense of unease. October 20th, 1924. I was right. The voices are not just in the walls. Last night, I followed them. They led me to the cellar, where I found something terrible. Father says it's nothing, just the house settling, but I know it's not. I saw something move in the shadows, something tall with glowing eyes. I know it wasn't just my imagination. I know what I saw. A chill ran down Emma's spine. She had felt something too. The house felt alive, but a creature in the cellar. Emma forced herself to keep reading, despite the creeping dread that made her want to close the book and run. October 25th, 1924. I've seen it again. Last night it came out of the walls. I don't know what it is, but it's not human. It whispered my name, and when it spoke, I could feel it in my bones. It told me to leave. It told me that this house is mine now, and I would never be able to leave. Father doesn't believe me. No one does. But I know what I saw, and I know it's waiting. I can't stop hearing it. The whispers are always there, always calling me. Father says I need to stop writing these things down, but I won't. I won't let it take me without a record. Emma's hands shook as she turned the final page, her eyes scanning the words that seemed to echo in her mind. October 30th, 1924. It's here. I can hear it breathing. I've locked myself in the attic. It wants me. It won't let me go. The house won't let me go. I think it has taken Father. It's too late for me. But if anyone finds this, please, do not come to Hollow Manor. Whatever you do, do not open the door to the cellar. It will take you too. The journal fell from Emma's hands, landing with a thud on the dusty floor. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing as the horrifying words sank in. The house won't let me go. Emma knew that this wasn't just a warning. It was a curse that had bound the Holloway family to this place, and now it was reaching out to her. The whispers grew louder as though responding to her fear. Emma stood frozen, her mind torn between fleeing the house and the irresistible pull to uncover the truth. It felt like the manor was calling to her, pushing her deeper into its secrets. Suddenly the silence was shattered by a loud crash from upstairs. Emma gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She wasn't alone. Someone or something was up there. Emma's pulse raced as the sound echoed through the dark hallways, reverberating off the walls like a warning. It wasn't just a crash. It sounded like something or someone was moving through the house. With her flashlight in hand, Emma cautiously made her way toward the staircase. Her body screamed at her to leave, but her feet moved on their own, pulled by an unseen force. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each step, each breath she took. As she ascended the staircase, the air grew colder. The flashlight flickered and then stabilized, casting long shadows along the walls. She could hear the creak of floorboards from above, but no footsteps followed. Just the unnerving sound of something dragging across the floor. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, her mind racing. She could turn back. She could leave right now and never come back to this cursed place. But there was something inside her that couldn't stop, something that needed to know what was in this house. The hallway was dark, but as her flashlight swept across it, she saw the faintest outline of a door at the far end. The door that led to the attic, Emma's. Breath caught in her throat. She knew where the whispers were coming from. They were coming from the attic, just like in the journal. She had to go there. With a sense of dread settling in her chest, Emma approached the door. As she reached for the handle, the temperature dropped dramatically, and her breath became visible in the air. The door opened with a groan, revealing a narrow wooden staircase leading up to the attic. She ascended slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her flashlight illuminated a small, cluttered space, filled with old furniture draped in sheets. It smelled musty, like something long forgotten, and then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, near the small window, there was a figure standing, motionless. The figure was tall, almost too tall for the cramped attic, and it was cloaked in shadows. Emma's throat tightened. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but slowly it turned its head toward her. The thing's eyes were wide and hollow, empty sockets staring back at her with an unsettling intensity. It was Margaret Holloway. She could tell by the shape of the face, the same face she had seen in the old family portraits downstairs, but Margaret was dead. She had been dead for decades. The figure opened its mouth, and a low, guttural whisper escaped. "Leave! Now!" Emma stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The whisper from the figure echoed in her mind, growing louder with every heartbeat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure's hollow eyes bore into her soul as if it could see every fear, every secret she had ever held. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, shaking the very walls around her. "Leave or be taken." In that moment, Emma understood the curse of Hollow Manor. It didn't just trap the living, it consumed them. It fed off their fear, their curiosity, and in return, it promised them nothing but endless torment. Margaret Holloway had never escaped the house, and neither would she. The manor had claimed her, and now it wanted Emma too. But Emma wasn't ready to give up just yet. She turned and bolted toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the house itself was trying to hold her in place. The whispers turned into maddened screams, and for a moment, Emma thought she heard something behind her, closing in on her every step. She reached the stairs and ran down, but as she reached the bottom, the ground beneath her feet gave way. The floor cracked open, revealing a yawning black void. Emma screamed, her body pitching forward, but she managed to catch herself on the edge of the hole. The whispers turned into laughter. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the air around her thick with the suffocating stench of rot. The hole in the floor yawned beneath her like an endless abyss, threatening to swallow her whole. She scrambled back from the edge, her hands slick with sweat as they gripped the splintered floorboards for support. "I need to get out of here." The thought echoed in her mind, louder than the whispers, more urgent than the laughter that seemed to come from every corner of the house. But the house didn't want her to leave. It needed her. That much was clear now. The eerie glow from the attic seemed to spill over the edges of the hole, painting the room in a sickly light. Emma glanced back toward the attic door, but it was gone, vanished into the shadows, as though the house itself had erased it. There was no escape through the stairs. There was nowhere to go but her flashlight flickered once more, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Emma caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness, something alive. Her breath caught in her throat as the darkness shifted, forming into the shape of a figure, a tall, looming figure with hollow eyes. The same hollow eyes that had stared at her in the attic. The figure stepped forward, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs jerking and twitching. Emma's body froze, paralyzed by the terror flooding her veins. The thing's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a low rasp that seemed to crawl under Emma's skin. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, the weight of fear pressing down on her chest. But in the corner of her mind, a desperate thought began to take shape. She had seen something in the journal. Margaret had written about something in the cellar, something the house was trying to protect, something that it wanted to keep hidden. Emma's mind raced. The cellar. Without thinking, she pushed herself away from the hole, her body shaking with adrenaline as she sprinted across the room toward the only other door she hadn't yet opened, the door leading to the cellar. The door, too. The cellar creaked open with a horrible groan, as if the house itself was protesting her intrusion. The air in the hallway grew even colder, and Emma could feel the temperature drop with each step she took toward the stairs leading down. The cellar was dark, so dark, in fact, that even the beam of her flashlight barely seemed to cut through it. The smell of mildew and dampness hit her as she descended, the stairs creaking under her feet like the bones of the house itself were crying out in pain. At the bottom of the stairs, Emma was confronted by an enormous iron door, its surface covered in rust and grime. A thick, black fog seemed to ooze from the cracks around it, curling into the air like serpents, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The whispers were louder now, louder than they had ever been. They weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from behind the door. "Open it!" they hissed, their voices rising in a chorus of sinister glee. Emma didn't hesitate. She reached for the door handle, the cold metal biting into her palm. With a grunt of effort, she twisted it, and the door groaned open, revealing a room so dark it swallowed her flashlight's light the moment she stepped inside. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, chained to the floor, was an enormous black stone altar. In the center of the altar, a grotesque, twisted shape pulsed with a sickly green glow. It was an eye, an enormous, pulsating, grotesque eye, far too large for any human being, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the stone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very air around her was alive with the hunger of the thing in the room. The walls seemed to close in, and Emma felt her pulse quicken. "It's waiting," came the whisper, this time from all around her. "It's waiting for you." Suddenly the chains rattled, and the eye snapped open, the blackness around it shifting and swirling like liquid. A figure emerged from the shadows, the same figure from the attic. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just Margaret Holloway's decaying form. It was something more. The figure was towering now, with limbs that twisted at unnatural angles, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice now deep and rumbling, filled with the weight of centuries of torment. "This is your punishment." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the figure advanced, but her mind was elsewhere, on the eye, on the altar. The symbols carved into the stone. She had seen them before, in the journal, and suddenly it all clicked into place. The Hollow family hadn't been cursed. They had made the curse. The eye wasn't just a symbol, it was a gate, a doorway. The family had been using the house to summon something dark, something ancient, something that fed on fear. And now it was reaching out to her. Without thinking, Emma bolted toward the altar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure reached for her, but she ducked under its grasp, leaping toward the stone eye. Her hands shook as she pressed her palm against the cold, slick stone. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to explode with light and sound. The whispers turned into screams, the walls groaning in agony as the house seemed to shake with fury. The eye pulsed, and Emma felt the ground beneath her feet give way. It wasn't just the house she was fighting against anymore. She tried to pull away, but her hand was stuck, glued to the stone, as if it were made of some kind of vile living substance. The darkness around her grew stronger, pressing against her, suffocating her, until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume her, a voice, clear and sharp, cut through the chaos. "Let her go." The figure screeched, its body contorting as the light from the eye flared blindingly bright. The darkness screamed, twisted, and then it shattered. When Emma opened her eyes again, she was lying on the cold stone floor of the cellar, gasping for breath. The eye was gone. The altar was empty. The room was silent. The whispers were gone. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the ordeal, and glanced around the cellar. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The house, once alive with malice, now felt still, hollow, as if the very soul of the place had been ripped out. The figure, Margaret Holloway, was nowhere to be seen. The chains were gone, the altar reduced to a pile of broken stone. It was over, but as Emma stood up, she felt the weight of something heavy in the air, a sense of finality. The house might be empty now, but it had taken something from her, something deep inside. She turned toward the stairs, the chill of the cellar still, clinging to her skin, and walked back toward the door. But before she left, she paused. The whispers. Were they really gone? She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of that room. Something that would always be with her, something waiting, hidden just beyond the shadows. The air outside the cellar was deceptively calm, a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside Emma's mind. Her every step felt heavier, as if the house had left a mark on her soul that would never fade. The oppressive feeling that had clung to her, urging her to stay, to uncover the truth, now felt like a distant echo. Yet, even in the silence, she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her insides. It was over, she told herself. The house was empty, the curse had been broken, but something inside her, something primal, knew better. Emma couldn't forget the sense that something had followed her, something darker and older than anything she had faced so far. She stepped out of the cellar, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on her as she made her way up the stairs. Her flashlight flickered one last time before going out, leaving her in total darkness. "Stop it, Emma," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of her vision. She reached the hallway, then the stairs leading back up to the first floor. It was too quiet now. The house had fallen still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. It was as though something were waiting for her to make a mistake, to let her guard down. "But I'm out of here. I'm leaving," Emma thought as she neared the front door. The front door was right there. Just a few more steps, and she could escape the nightmare that had haunted her for days. Her hand reached for the door handle, but something in the corner of her eye stopped her. The old mirror by the entrance shimmered strangely in the dim light. She didn't remember it looking that way before. It had always been cracked, a flaw that added to the eerie feel of the house. But now, it was as if the glass itself was alive, moving, pulsing. She froze, the reflection staring back at her. Wasn't her own. It was someone else, a woman, long dark hair tangled, face gaunt and pale. Her eyes were wide, hollow, as if they were pleading for help. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back. The reflection of the woman raised her hand slowly and pointed directly at her. Emma's heart began to race. Her eyes flickered back to the mirror. There was no woman standing in the entryway, no one but her. She turned back to the door, her hand still on the knob. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to move. The mirror had always been a strange piece of the house, but now it was the key to something far worse. The woman in the mirror had a story, and Emma could feel it. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the past, it was holding it. She was being pulled in, drawn by the same invisible force that had kept her here this whole time. Her body trembled with fear. The woman in the reflection raised both hands now, pressing her palms against the glass. Emma stepped forward, hypnotized by the motion, her hand moving toward the cold, reflective surface. A crack ran down the center of the glass, and a low, growling noise emanated from it. The whispers returned, but they weren't just whispers, they were voices, angry, furious voices, and the woman in the mirror. Her eyes were now filled with rage. Pure rage. "Get out," the reflection hissed. But the voice was no longer that of the woman. It was deeper, more guttural. "This is my house." Suddenly, the mirror shattered. The glass splintered and exploded outward, sending shards clattering to the floor at Emma's feet. She screamed, falling back against the wall as the echoes of the broken glass rang through the house. But the chaos didn't stop there. The house, which had seemed so still, now felt alive. Alive in a way Emma hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just the mirror that was cracked. The walls groaned, the ceiling shifted, and something deep within the house stirred, as though waking from a long slumber. Emma's pulse raced as the floor beneath her shook. She could hear it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, dragging closer and closer. Her breath hitched as a voice rumbled from the walls. "You never should have left." The temperature in the hallway plummeted. Emma glanced toward the stairs, her escape route, but it was blocked. The doorway that had once led to freedom was now a void filled with thick black fog. The walls around her began to pulse, the dark shadows crawling like tendrils of smoke. The house was changing, and then from the shadows, she saw it. The figure standing in the doorway. It was Margaret Holloway. No longer a decaying spectre, but something more, something other. Her eyes were wide and black, her mouth twisted into a smile that was far too large for her face. She moved toward Emma with unnatural speed, her limbs elongating like a puppet on strings. "You thought you escaped," the figure purred, its voice oozing with malice. "But you can never leave, Emma. Not now. Not ever." Emma's knees gave way beneath her as the figure lunged. She scrambled backward, her mind a whirlwind of panic. She had no idea what was happening, but she couldn't face Margaret, or whatever she had become. It wasn't just Margaret anymore, it was the house, and it had come to claim her. As the figure closed in on her, Emma's mind raced for an escape. She had to leave, had to get out. But how? The house seemed to have taken on a life of its own, the walls shifting and pulsing with dark energy. The front door was no longer an option. The entire house was a trap, and Emma was its prey. Suddenly, her eyes landed on something. The shattered pieces of the mirror scattered across the floor. The glass. The reflection. There was something she hadn't noticed before in the broken shards. A pattern. The glass pieces were arranged almost like a sigil, a ritualistic design. The shape of the eye, the same shape she had seen on the altar in the cellar. Without thinking, Emma crawled toward the pieces, grabbing a shard of glass in her trembling hand. It felt powerful. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, the house shook violently. The walls groaned with rage. The figure of Margaret let out a howl of fury. "No!" it screamed, its distorted voice crackling like breaking glass. "You cannot stop it!" But it was too late. As Emma stood, the shard in her hand glowing with an eerie light, she realized what she had to do. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a vessel that had been holding something far darker than Margaret Holloway, something ancient, something that fed on fear and death. With the shard in hand, Emma stepped forward, holding it out toward the figure. Margaret screamed, but Emma pressed the shard forward, the light from it growing brighter until it felt like the house itself was being torn apart. "You're free," Emma whispered. "We're both free." With a final desperate screech, the figure vanished. The house trembled one last time, its dark energy unraveling as the light from the shard swallowed it whole. When Emma opened her eyes again, the house was silent. The air was still. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something chilling. The shards of the broken mirror were still there, scattered across the floor, glowing, with the same dark energy. "It's not over," Emma realized with growing horror. She had escaped. But the house had only changed. It would wait. And when they came, the house would claim them. Emma left the house, or at least she thought she did. The drive back to the city was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, eyes darting nervously in the rear view mirror. The roads were long and empty, a haunting quiet surrounding her. The sky had grown dark, thick clouds swirling overhead, as if the universe itself was closing in on her. But it was more than that. There was something else, something she couldn't shake, a weight that pressed down on her chest. "It's not over." The thoughts circled endlessly in her mind, like a taunting refrain. She had escaped the house, but deep down, Emma knew it wasn't the house she had to worry about. It was what it had turned into, the ancient darkness that had once been imprisoned. There was still out there, still watching. It wasn't the walls of the house that bound it, after all. It was the very reflection of the house that had seeped into her. 2 weeks had passed since she left Holloway House. Emma had gone through the motions, returning to work, trying to push the horrors from her mind. But no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to live a normal life, she couldn't escape the feeling that the house was always there, just behind her. It was when she began to dream again. The dreams, vivid, terrifying, had started slowly at first. At night she would find herself standing in the hallway of the house again. The walls would pulse with that dark energy, the very air thick with fear. The same whispers would fill her ears, only this time, they weren't coming from the house. They were coming from within her. The reflection in the mirror, the same woman who had pointed at her, was always there, watching her with those empty, hollow eyes. Emma's heart would race in the dream, her limbs frozen in place as the woman approached, her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "You thought you were free." The words echoed in her mind, like the voice of the house itself. But when Emma would try to wake up, she couldn't. The dream would stretch on, the darkness around her growing thicker with every passing second. Then one night, something changed. She found herself at the mirror again, standing in the hallway of the house, its reflection now clear and sharp, like a doorway into another realm. She stepped closer, hesitant. The woman in the reflection wasn't the only one staring back at her this time. There was someone else, standing just behind her, someone with familiar features, someone she had known once, her own reflection. Emma's breath caught. This wasn't a reflection of her from the past, not from the house. It was now. Before she could react, her own reflection reached out of the mirror and grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her in with terrifying strength. Emma screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. Emma woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The morning sunlight filtered through the window, peaceful, quiet. It was over. It had to be. It was just a dream. But when she checked the time, her breath hitched in her throat. It was exactly the same hour as when she had fallen asleep. No, something was wrong. Something had followed her. She grabbed her phone, searching for any trace of Holloway House in the news, anything that might explain why the house still haunted her, why the dreams were worsening. But everything was strangely quiet. There were no new reports of missing persons, no evidence that anyone else had experienced the horrors she had. It was like the house had simply disappeared. Her hands shook as she scrolled through old news articles, trying to find any sign of what happened to the Holloway family. She came across a photograph of Margaret Holloway, the woman who had been the first victim of the house's twisted power. In the photo, Margaret looked almost normal, young, alive. But there was something odd about the picture. A strange shadow seemed to hover behind her, stretching unnaturally long. Emma's fingers froze as she stared at it. It was the same shadow she had seen in the reflection, the thing that had been watching her. Emma's pulse raced as the answer began to form in her mind. The house wasn't just a structure, it was an anchor, a prison for something ancient, something that thrived on fear. And Margaret had been its first victim, drawn into the reflection, just as Emma had been. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was the reflection, the mirror, that had the power to draw souls into its grasp. And Emma realized, with growing horror, that she was no longer the same person who had walked into Holloway House. The house Emma had changed escape. Not anymore. The reflection that had once been merely a fragment of the house now seemed to have taken on a life of its own, a power that couldn't be contained. It was as if the house's curse had merged with her, feeding on her every fear, every doubt. She had thought the house was gone, but it had only been waiting, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just in her dreams anymore. Emma looked at herself in the bathroom mirror that night. She could see it in her eyes. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. There was something else there, something that was not quite human. Her own eyes blinked before she did, her reflection's lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers. "It's waiting." The whispers started again, louder than before, filling her mind with maddening clarity. With trembling hands, she reached out to touch the mirror, and the surface rippled like water. It's not over. It's just beginning. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror grinned wickedly, the face distorting into something far more sinister. Emma recoiled, but her hand was stuck, held by something cold, wet, and alive. The reflection pulled at her. It was pulling her in, and no matter how hard she fought, Emma couldn't break free. She felt herself slipping into the glass, into the darkness that lurked just behind it. And as she was dragged further in, she heard the laughter again, the deep guttural laughter of something ancient and terrible that had been waiting for her all along. Emma's world darkened. She was no longer in her apartment. She was standing back in that hallway, in the heart of Holloway House, surrounded by the darkness and the pulse of fear. But this time, there was no escape. The house had claimed her. The woman in the mirror, her reflection, stood before her, smiling with malice, the darkness swirling around them. She reached out, grasping Emma's hand with a strength that was both cold and suffocating. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, as she realized the truth. The house was never truly haunted. It was never just the curse of Margaret Holloway or the family's dark history. It was the reflection that had always been the source of the house's power, the reflection that never stopped watching. And now, Emma was a part of it. She had become the reflection. The house had claimed her as it had claimed so many others, and now she was trapped, forever caught in the mirror's cold embrace, waiting for the next soul to come and join her. Emma's reality was dissolving around her, the very air becoming thick, as though she were being submerged in dark water. Her hands reached for anything to hold on to, but the shadows consumed her, pulling her deeper into the reflection that had once only haunted her dreams. The last thing she remembered was the cold, sharp feeling of the glass around her as it began to close in, and then nothing. For what seemed like an eternity, Emma floated in darkness, weightless, suspended between two worlds. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. She couldn't even tell if she had a body. There was only the endless void, but then a voice, a whisper, cut through the dark. "You are not alone, Emma." The voice was familiar, but it was not hers. It was Margaret Holloway's voice, the voice of the woman who had first drawn her into this nightmare. "You have joined us now." Emma tried to scream, but no sound came from her lips. Her mind spun, her thoughts churning like a whirlwind. She was trapped, and there was no escape. "It is not the house you must fear," the voice continued, as if it could read her every thought. "It is the reflection that has claimed us. The mirror is a doorway, a passage into another world, a world where time and space have no meaning." Emma felt something cold brush against her skin, and she shuddered. She turned, or at least she tried to, but there was nothing to see. There was only darkness, and then, from the corner of her vision, she caught sight of something. A figure. It was standing in the distance, a shadow among shadows, and as it stepped closer, Emma realized it was another reflection. But this one was different. This reflection wasn't just a woman. It was a collection of countless figures, all contorted, merged together, one face blurring into another. It was a manifestation of everything the mirror had ever taken. "This is where we all go," Margaret's voice echoed. "The reflection is a prison, and we are its prisoners. We were once alive, but we are no more. And now, so are you." Emma's pulse quickened as she felt herself being pulled toward the figure. The closer she got, the clearer the faces became, faces she recognized. Faces of the missing, the lost, all those who had disappeared into Holloway House over the years. They were there, trapped in the reflection, their eyes like wide in silent screams, her voice now their bodies twisted in but there is one thing you must understand. Once you cross over into this side, you can never go back. Emma fought the overwhelming feeling of being sucked into the reflection, into the abyss. The faces, the figures, they seemed to stretch, their mouths opening in silent cries. The walls around her seemed to warp, growing tighter, pressing in on her. The very fabric of this dark world was unraveling, and she could feel herself being torn apart with it. Her mind screamed for release. She couldn't stay here. Not forever. "You must escape," Margaret's voice urged, now growing more urgent, more desperate. "You can escape, but only by taking the place of another." Emma blinked, trying to focus. "What do you mean?" Her voice was a mere whisper, lost in the void. "The mirror can only hold so many." Margaret continued. "It needs new souls to sustain itself, to grow, to remain alive, to remain forever in the dark." The words twisted inside Emma's chest, a sharp pang of realization clawing at her heart. "If you don't take someone else's place, you will be lost, forever, just like us." Margaret's voice shattered, and Emma could feel the terror that gripped her. There was no way out. But then Emma remembered. She had seen the pattern, the sigil, the strange designs before. Back in the house, in the shattered pieces of the mirror, there was a way out, a way to break the curse, but it wasn't through escape. It was through sacrifice. If she could find a way to shatter the reflection itself, she could break the cycle. But to do that, she needed to understand the mirror's true power, and to do that, she had to confront what she feared the most. Emma's surroundings began to shift again, as though the very nature of this world was unstable. The endless darkness around her warped and spiraled, the twisted figures now merging into one collective presence, pressing in from all sides. Their whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were all begging for release. "You can't escape," one of them hissed, a face half-formed, grotesque. "You're one of us now. You'll never leave." But Emma refused to believe it. She didn't have to give in. The house had been built on the strength of the curse. The reflection was its anchor. She had to confront the darkness within it, to destroy it from the core. The mirror's power was ancient, rooted in fear, in the souls it had claimed. "No," Emma whispered to herself. "I won't become one of you." Her mind raced, and slowly a plan began to form. She needed to take control. She needed to bend the reflection to her will, to break the hold it had over her. She closed her eyes and focused, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. Her pulse was a steady drumbeat in her ears. She reached out, reaching for the dark energy that bound her to the mirror, pulling it toward her, channeling it through her. The reflection twisted violently in response, the faces distorting, screaming, pleading. "You can't. You're one of us now," they shouted. Emma ignored the voices. She had to push past them, past the fear that had once consumed her, and find the heart of the darkness. She could feel it, deep in the center, an ancient evil that had fed on every soul that had ever stepped into the house. It was powerful, but it was also fragile. With a scream that shook the very foundation of the dark realm, Emma broke the reflection. She shattered it into 1,000 shards, sending the dark energy splintering out into the void. The world around Emma dissolved into fragments of light and shadow, the echoes of the figure's screams fading into nothingness. For the first time, since she had entered the mirror's world, Emma felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The curse was broken. She opened her eyes, and the world around her was different. There was no more darkness. No more twisted figures. The reflection was gone. But there was still something. She glanced toward a dark corner of the room she found herself in. A mirror stood there, cracked and fractured but still intact, and standing in front of it, she saw a reflection, her own. But this time she was no longer trapped. She was free. She stepped forward, the air around her thick with a strange sense of finality. This was it. The house was gone. The curse was broken, or so she thought. The reflection smiled at her, but it wasn't her smile. It was the house's, and it was still watching. Chapter 24. The Echo of the Past. The air around Emma felt heavier now, more suffocating, as if the world she stepped back into was no longer the same. She stood before the cracked mirror, her reflection twisted in ways it never had been before. The smile, that sinister smile, stretched Emma's wider quickened with each passing second. She had thought she was free, as though the glass curse had been become a window, but as her eyes something darted toward the reflection, she realized that with a sickening certainty that the true evil had only just begun to reveal itself. The smile in the mirror grew darker, colder. The woman who had once been her was now a hollow, empty shell. Her reflection was not truly hers. It was something other, something bound to the mirror, a shadow of the past that refused to die. You can never truly escape. The reflection whispered, its voice warped, unrecognizable. The mirror doesn't release its prisoners. It only waits for the next one to come. Emma's heart raced, and she turned away from the mirror, desperate to leave, but something held her there. The room, once familiar, seemed to bend and shift around her. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, closing in on her, trapping her in this cycle that had no end. She stumbled back, her breath shallow and ragged, her mind spinning. What was happening? How was this possible? She had broken the reflection, shattered the dark hold it had on her, hadn't she? The mirror's surface rippled again, and Emma's eyes were drawn back to it, unwillingly. The reflection was no longer just her. It was something else now. Many figures, many faces, all blending together in a maddening whirlpool. They were like the souls that had once been trapped in the mirror, now released, seeking vengeance, seeking release. And then she saw it. Among the twisted figures standing out from the rest was the figure of Margaret Holloway, the woman's. Eyes were wide, filled with torment, but also with something else. Something familiar. She was staring directly at Emma, as if she had seen her before, as if she knew her. "You are part of it now," Margaret's voice echoed in Emma's mind. "You can never break free. The mirror never lets go." Emma's legs buckled beneath her, her mind reeling with the impossible reality. The curse wasn't just bound to the house. It wasn't just a place. It was a pattern, a cycle that fed on fear, on desperation, on the souls of the lost. And now Emma had become a part of it. The mirror had claimed her, just as it had claimed Margaret, just as it had claimed all those who came before her. The world around Emma continued to bend and twist, a swirling vortex of images, memories, and faces. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. The figures in the mirror reached out to her, their eyes pleading, their hands clawing at the glass. They weren't just reflections. They were real. They were alive, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, pulling at the edges of her reality. Emma closed her eyes, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream. She had to think, had to find a way out, but there was nothing, no escape, no answers. "You're not alone," the voices whispered over and over until it became a chant, a mantra. "You're never alone." She opened her eyes again. The mirror's surface had shifted. The faces that once stared back at her were now contorted in grotesque ways, their mouths open in silent screams. They were alive, all of them, bound to the glass, their consciousnesses trapped in a prison of reflection. But something was different this time. Among the figures in the mirror, Emma saw a new face. It wasn't one of the lost souls from the house. It was a face she recognized, her own, but it wasn't her. It was the version of herself she had seen in the dream, the one that had pulled her into the mirror, the one that had changed her. And now, she was staring back at Emma, her eyes gleaming, with something dark and twisted, a reflection within a reflection, a trap within a trap. "I am you," the reflection said, its voice cold, devoid of humanity. "And you are me." Emma's heart sank. She felt the weight of the truth crash down on her. The mirror wasn't just a passage between worlds. It was a prison for souls, for all those who had become part of its endless cycle. She was one of them now, and there was no escape. Emma and Margaret stood side by side, their faces pressed against the surface of the cracked mirror. The world around them was collapsing, the fabric of the reflection tearing apart at the seams. They had one chance, one final chance to escape the cycle. With every ounce of strength, they focused on the reflection. They channeled their fear, their anger, their desperation into a single, unified force. The mirror trembled, its surface rippling like water, a crack forming down the center. The voices of the lost souls grew louder, a cacophony of anguish and fury. The mirror was fighting back, but Emma and Margaret refused to let it win. "Together," Emma whispered, "we can break free." And with one final, powerful surge, they pushed against the glass. The mirror shattered into 1,000 shards, the darkness retreating, the curse unraveling. For the first time in years, Emma felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The world around her began to fade, the figures in the mirror dissipating into nothingness. She was free. Epilogue. The quiet. Aftermath. The house was gone. The mirror was broken. And Emma was finally free. But as she stood in the quiet aftermath, she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection still watched her. Somewhere out there, a fragment of the mirror remained, waiting, and the cycle, she knew, was never truly broken. It was only waiting for the next soul to fall into its trap, and that soul might just be hers. The air in the room still held an uneasy stillness after the mirror shattered. The crackling energy that had once thrived in the house had finally faded, but Emma could still feel it in the pit of her stomach. Her heart raced, but it wasn't the same fear she had felt before. It was the fear of unfinished business. Margaret's voice, now softer, echoed in her mind. "You don't understand. This is just the beginning. The mirror doesn't let go of its prisoners that easily." Emma shook her head, trying to push away the memory of Margaret's cold words. She had won. The mirror was destroyed. The curse was broken. There was nothing left but the silence of the empty house. Wasn't there? She turned away from the remnants of the mirror on the floor, the shards scattered like forgotten memories. The house seemed almost peaceful, as if it was finally at rest. But it was an illusion. Emma could feel the house breathing, as though the walls themselves were alive. There was a hum in the air, subtle but growing louder. It was as if the house was whispering, calling to her, and then it hit her, the reflection. It had never really been just the mirror. It was the house. The mirror was the manifestation of something darker, a force rooted deep within the bones of the very building. The house itself had been feeding on souls for years, twisting reality to claim them. The reflection was simply a tool, a doorway, an anchor to something much more ancient and far-reaching. Emma froze in her tracks. She had destroyed the mirror, but she had only scratched the surface of the true evil that lay beneath. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be happening. It's over." But something in her gut told her otherwise. She had been so focused on the mirror, on the glass that had trapped everyone who stepped into the house, that she had never truly understood what kept them trapped. The reflection wasn't the cause, it was just the effect. The house itself was the curse, the house itself was alive, and now it was calling to her. Emma ran through the halls of the house, her mind a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The house felt alive, like it was reaching for her, dragging her back into its grasp. Each step she took seemed to echo louder in her ears, as if the walls were closing in around her. The house wasn't empty, it wasn't finished, and neither was she. She sprinted down the hallway toward the staircase, but before she could reach the stairs, the air grew thick, pressing against her, pushing her backward. The walls seemed to flex and bend, reshaping themselves, as though the house was reordering itself around her. "You can't leave," a voice murmured from the shadows. It was a voice she recognized. Margaret. Emma turned to find Margaret standing. At the end of the hallway, her figure impossibly still. Her eyes, once filled with torment, were now eerily calm. It was as if she had fully embraced the darkness that had consumed her. Her reflection in the walls
Emma's
danced,
voice caught.
shifting
"I thought
and
you were
contorting,
free."
in ways
Margaret
that made
smiled,
Emma's
the
expression
stomach
almost sad, but with an unsettling calmness. "Free," she echoed. "The house never lets anyone truly leave. Not once it's tasted your soul." Emma recoiled. "You're lying." But Margaret only shook her head slowly. "You don't understand, Emma. You were never meant to leave. The house, it feeds on souls. It has for centuries. All of those who entered were nothing but fuel, their pain, and fear absorbed by the walls, by the mirrors. The curse, the house itself, It can't be broken. The mirror was just a part of it. A doorway. A trap. Emma's mind spun, her thoughts crashing into one another. She had been so sure, so confident that breaking the mirror would end it all. But Margaret's words left her hollow. If the house was alive, what had she really destroyed? No, Emma whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. I did it. I broke the mirror. You're lying. You must be. Margaret took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with a terrible ancient knowledge. No, Emma, I'm not lying. The house is still here. It will always be here. And now it wants you. It has chosen you. A sinking feeling spread through Emma's chest. The house didn't just want her to stay. It wanted her soul. It had claimed Margaret's, and now it was claiming hers. Before Emma could react, the hallway behind her began to twist, the walls stretching and pulling toward her. The once solid floor beneath her feet began to warp, turning soft and fluid, as though the house itself was a living organism, reaching out to devour her. Margaret's form began to fade, her figure dissolving into the air like mist. But her voice remained. It's already too late, Emma. The last words were like a cold wind, cutting through Emma's resolve. She felt a strange compulsion to look at the broken mirror once again. The shards were not just remnants of glass. They were gateways. The mirror had shattered, but each shard still reflected the house, the darkness, the endless cycle. Emma's eyes widened in realization. The reflection wasn't just an image. It was a prison. It was the house. Desperation clawed at Emma's chest. As she ran, the house shifting and distorting around her. No matter where she turned, the walls seemed to close in, the path leading her towards something she couldn't escape. She had to get out. She had to. Her eyes darted to the far side of the hallway where a door stood ajar, beckoning her. She ran toward it without thinking, pushing past the creeping dread that gnawed at her every step. Beyond the door, a staircase spiraled downward into darkness, deeper than the house should have allowed. The air was thick with dust, and the faintest whispers of long-forgotten voices lingered in the silence. Emma didn't hesitate. She descended, her breath heavy, her mind consumed by the realization that the house was no longer just a place. It was alive. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a vast, dimly lit room. The walls stretched far beyond what should have been possible, and in the center there stood an altar, crowned with an ancient mirror. The mirror, not a reflection of her, but the house itself. And she knew, with sudden, terrible clarity, that the house had been waiting for her. This was the heart of it. The source, a pulse of dark energy emanated from the mirror, vibrating through the very air, the house's heartbeat. And at that moment, Emma realized that there was only one way to break the curse, one way to end the house's reign of terror. She would have to become part of it. Emma stood at the altar, the mirror before her. She could feel the pull of it deep inside her. It was calling to her, pulling her toward its power, toward its darkness. In the mirror, she saw herself again, but this time her reflection wasn't distorted. It was clear, it was whole. And then she saw Margaret's face beside hers, the others too, all of them, their souls now part of the house, their reflections forever etched into the glass. You cannot break it, Margaret's voice echoed again. You can only choose to be its keeper. Emma's heart pounded as the truth settled over her like a shroud. To destroy the house, to truly end it, she would have to take its place. The house needed her. To remain, to survive, to feed. She felt the weight of the decision crushing her chest. She could run, try to escape, but that would only lead to her eventual death, to her soul being devoured like all the others, or she could choose to end the cycle, choose to bind herself to the house, to become its final reflection. Would she become the next Margaret Holloway? Emma stood frozen, her mind swirling with the impossible choice laid before her. The house called to her, its presence wrapping around her like a suffocating cloud. She could feel the weight of its darkness, its insatiable hunger for souls, pulling at her very being. The mirror before her shimmered, and she could see the reflection of her own face, clear, unbroken. But there was something else, something darker. Margaret's ghostly form stood beside her, her cold eyes filled with both regret and resignation. "It's your choice now," Margaret's voice whispered. "You can't escape. You're part of it, just as I was. And if you don't take its place, it will consume you." Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the mirror, each movement feeling like it was taking her closer to something irreversible. The reflection of herself in the glass began to change, her own features twisting, warping into something darker, something cruel. "You're not free, Emma," the voice echoed in her mind. It was her own voice, but it was tinged with a mocking tone. "You never were." Emma clenched her fists, fighting back the panic that threatened to take over. She refused to believe it. She refused to accept that she was nothing more than another, prisoner of this house. And then she remembered the one thing that had brought her this far, the one thing that had always guided her, even when it felt like the darkness was too much to bear. She was stronger than this. She wasn't like Margaret. She wouldn't let the house claim her. She wouldn't let it use her as a vessel to feed on the lost souls of the past. Emma had already broken the mirror once. She had broken through the cycle. She had to do it again. She had no time to waste. With a single breath, Emma turned away from the mirror. The room trembled, the house groaning as though it were alive, as if it could feel her defiance. She felt the walls pulse around her, the oppressive weight of the curse pushing against her, trying to pull her back, trying to drag her into the void. But Emma would not be its prisoner. "You can't escape," Margaret's voice came again, this time filled with a chilling finality. "You can't win. You are already part of it, Emma." But Emma had a different plan. She wasn't going to fight the house head on. She wasn't going to try to destroy it with brute force. She was going to do something the house hadn't anticipated. She was going to take its power and use it against itself. The altar at the center of the room, the heart of the house, called to her. The energy swirling around it was like a magnetic pull, drawing her closer. But Emma didn't walk toward it in fear. She walked toward it with purpose. She wasn't here to destroy the house. She was here to take it back. "If I am to be its keeper, I will be its master," she muttered to herself. "It will feed on no more souls. It will feed on nothing." Emma reached for the ancient mirror, now glowing with a dark, pulsating energy. As her fingers brushed against the surface, she felt it, a flood of memories of the souls trapped within the house. Their screams, their pain, their regrets, they all came rushing to her. She could feel their anguish, their suffering, but she wasn't afraid. She absorbed it. She took their pain and turned it into strength. The mirror began to shatter. Not in a violent explosion, but in a slow, deliberate fracture. It cracked into 1,000 pieces, each shard suspended in midair, floating like stars in the vast emptiness of the room. And then, in that moment of pure clarity, Emma did something the house had never expected. She focused on the mirror, on the souls trapped within it, on the very essence of the house. She spoke the words aloud, each syllable resonating with power. "I release you." The shards of the mirror began to dissolve, the glass crumbling away into nothing. The house trembled violently as its hold on the souls weakened. Emma's pulse raced as she felt the energy surge through her, growing stronger with every breath she took. Margaret's voice cried out one last time, desperate and haunting. "No, you can't!" But Emma was no longer listening. She could feel the dark energy coursing through her, like electricity. And with a single, powerful thought, she released the house collapsed, the curse, but it wasn't like before, when the wall unraveled, crumbled under the weight of her fear. No, this time it was different. It was as though the very foundation of the house had been ripped from the earth, torn apart at its core. The darkness that had once consumed it began to fade, leaving only the bare bones of the house behind. Emma stood in the center of the ruins, her body trembling, but her mind clear. The house was gone, its power broken. The curse had been shattered for good, but even as she stood there, feeling the weight of her victory, something gnawed at her. The silence in the air was thick, suffocating, and it wasn't the same silence that had greeted her upon her first arrival. This silence was different, it was too still, and then she saw it. In the distance, among the remains of the house, a small fragment of the shattered mirror glinted in the light. It was a single shard, tiny but sharp, and as Emma stared at it, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Was the house truly gone? Her hand trembled as she reached out toward the shard. There was something familiar about it, something that pulled at her. It was a feeling that shouldn't have been there. The curse, the mirror, the house. It couldn't be over. Not yet. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew was coming. Emma picked up the shard, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. But as soon as she touched it, she felt a jolt of energy course through her body. It was the same energy, the same darkness that had plagued her since the moment she had first stepped into the house. And this time, it wasn't just a passing sensation. It was inside her, wrapped around her very soul. In that instant, Emma realized the truth. The house hadn't been destroyed. It had only changed form. The mirror, the curse, the energy, it was all a part of her now. She had become the keeper. The house's power was inside her, and as long as she held the shard, she would carry it with her. She was no longer just a prisoner of the house. She was its new heart. But Emma wouldn't be trapped. Not like the others. Not like Margaret. She would take control of the power within her. She would reshape it. The house was gone, but she was not. And the world outside would never know the true price of breaking the curse. Emma's fingers curled around the shard, and the world seemed to bend around her. The once chaotic dark energy of the house now swirled within her, a low hum vibrating in her chest. The curse wasn't gone. It was hers to carry now, to shape, to wield. Her heart pounded as she stood amidst the wreckage of the house, her mind grappling with the enormity of what she had just done. The house, the mirror, the curse, it had all become hers. Emma had taken control, but what did that even mean? Was she still herself, or was she now something else entirely? She closed her eyes, breathing in the stale air of the ruins. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with an unfamiliar power that surged within her. It was the power of the house, but it wasn't just darkness. It was everything, the trapped souls, the memories, the walls that had once moved at their own will. It was all inside her now, all at once. For a fleeting moment, Emma considered destroying the shard, throwing it far away, ending it. But she knew that wouldn't work. The power was already inside her. If she got rid of the shard, it would find a way back, perhaps in another form, in another mirror, in another house. She couldn't run. Not anymore. She had become the keeper, but there was a cold comfort in that realization. For the first time, she felt in control. Her pulse slowed as she steadied herself. She wasn't going to let the darkness consume her. She wasn't going to let it twist her into the thing the house had made of Margaret. She had to find a way, to contain it, to ensure it would never hurt anyone again. But the power, the whispering voices, it was overwhelming. She could feel them in the back of her mind, clawing to be heard. The house wasn't finished. It had only changed its shape. She could feel the weight of it bearing down on her, the immense responsibility of holding something so dangerous. There was no longer any sign of the once imposing structure. All that remained was a barren landscape of charred wood and twisted metal. Yet, even in the destruction, Emma could feel something more subtle, almost imperceptible, A pulse. The house was still there, not in its original form, not in the physical space it had once occupied, but its influence, its presence, it was in the air, in the earth beneath her feet. The house had become something else, something far more insidious, far more subtle. Emma's hand tightened around the shard as a deep, cold voice rose up from the pit of her soul. You are ours now. The days after the destruction of the house passed in a haze. Emma retreated into herself, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She could still feel the house inside her, the weight of its power pressing down on her every moment. It was like a constant hum at the back of her mind, like a living thing, twisting and turning, always there. Sometimes she could hear the voices more clearly, their whispers like a faint breeze. Other times, it was a presence, one that would stir restlessly inside her, urging her to do something. But she didn't know what. She had tried to keep herself grounded in the reality of the world around her. She had tried to live a normal life, to pretend that the house, the curse, was behind her. But there were moments, late at night, when she felt the pull. She would wake, drenched in sweat, her body frozen with terror as the memories of the house flooded back to her. The reflection, the broken mirrors, the shattered lives, and always the voice calling to her from the depths of her own soul. You cannot run from us. It had been a week since the destruction of the house, and Emma found herself standing on the edge of the same cliff where she had once stood with Margaret, overlooking the ruins of what had been the house. The wind whipped through her hair, and she closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The world felt empty. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. She felt a sharp tug in her chest, like a magnetic pull. Her eyes snapped open, and in the distance, barely visible in the setting sun, she saw something, a dark figure, a silhouette standing among the ruins, motionless. Emma's breath caught in her throat as her heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was Margaret. No, it wasn't just Margaret. The woman who stood there, her face pale and vacant, was not just a ghost. She was more than that. She was a part of the house now, just as Emma had become. Her reflection, her soul had been absorbed by the house, and now it had come to collect. The house was calling, and it was calling her. Margaret's figure drifted toward her, a cold, unnatural stillness in her movements. Emma's legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. The tug inside her chest grew stronger, like an invisible thread pulling her closer to Margaret, pulling her towards something she couldn't escape. Emma! Margaret's voice came, low and hollow. The sound was eerily calm, but it carried an edge of something ancient, something deep. You know what you have to do. The house has claimed you, just as it claimed me. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the thrum of energy inside her, the power of the house stirring, growing stronger with every heartbeat. Margaret continued, her voice barely more than a whisper now, but it was everywhere, pressing in on Emma from all directions. We are the keepers now. The house is a part of us, and we are a part of it. There is no escape. Emma tried to resist. She closed her eyes, focused on the shard still clenched tightly in her hand. The power of the house, the darkness, it was inside her, but it didn't have to consume her. She didn't have to give in to it, but as the wind howled around her, the whispers grew louder. The house was inside her mind. She could feel the edges of her consciousness, the hunger for her soul. Come, Emma. But she knew one thing for certain now. The house didn't just want her. It needed her, and she was going to make sure it never took anyone again. With a forceful breath, Emma raised the shard high, her voice cutting through the whispers. No, she said, her words trembling but fierce. I won't be your prisoner. I won't let you claim me. The energy inside her surged almost violently. The house recoiled at her defiance, as if it had never expected such resistance. Margaret's face twisted into a grimace, her hollow eyes narrowing in disdain. You think you can stop it? Margaret's voice was icy, mocking. You are the house now. You cannot fight what you have become. Emma's grip on the shard tightened, her fingers glowing with the energy of the house. She didn't know if it was possible, but she felt it. The power that had consumed so many souls, her soul. It could be turned. She could turn it back. She could rewrite the curse. I am not you, Emma said, her voice steady. I am not a prisoner. With a single, desperate thought, she focused every ounce of strength she had on the shard. She poured her will into it, demanding the house bend to her. The wind howled. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the house screamed. Emma's pulse echoed in her ears as the shard glowed brighter in her hand, the energy surging through her like an unstoppable force. The house groaned around her, its very foundations trembling in protest. The walls, once oppressive and alive with the souls they had swallowed, now seemed to shrink back as if afraid of the power she held. You are the heart of it now, Margaret's voice whispered, like a shadow brushing against Emma's mind. You cannot destroy it. It is part of you, just as you are part of it. The words were heavy, laden with truth. Emma could feel the essence of the house deep inside her, its hunger, its need. It was a part of her, just as it had been a part of Margaret, of everyone who had been consumed by its darkness. She wasn't just fighting the house, she was fighting herself. But that thought, that realization, was enough to fuel her resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't going to let the house take her, twist her into something unrecognizable. She had fought too hard to let that happen now. Emma clenched her jaw and took a step forward, her feet grounded in the crumbled remains of the house, the shards of glass still shimmering in the air around her like fragments of lost souls. She could feel their presence, their eyes, their longing for release. You cannot control it forever, Margaret whispered again, her voice like a haunting melody. It will consume you as it did me. You are already its keeper. You cannot undo what has been done. Emma's eyes flashed with determination. I'm not afraid of it. Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had ever been. I'm stronger than you think. With a fierce twist of her wrist, Emma thrust the shard into the ground, and the air around her erupted with a violent crackle. The house trembled violently, the very walls shaking as the darkness within them fought back, trying to reclaim its power. Emma's body was alight with the raw energy of the house, but she stood firm, breathing deeply, focused on the singular truth that had brought her here. She had a choice. She had always had a choice. The house had no hold over her unless she allowed it to. For a moment, everything fell still. The wind stopped howling, the walls stopped groaning, the energy inside her was pulsing, but it was not chaotic now. It was controlled. Emma could feel the house waiting, its presence swirling beneath the surface of her thoughts, its hunger still gnawing at the edges of her mind. But Emma no longer feared it. She was its master now. She would shape it, use it, and prevent it from ever consuming another soul again. As she stood there, eyes closed, her breath steady, she felt the power of the house rippling beneath her feet, like the calm before the storm. And in the center of that storm was the mirror, the heart of the house, the source of its power. In her mind she saw it, a darkened room, the same room she had first entered, the mirror gleaming on the wall. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a portal, a window into the heart of the house itself. Through it, Emma could see the faces of the lost souls, those who had been claimed, those who had been trapped within the house. She could hear their voices now, louder, clearer than before. Emma, one voice whispered. It was soft, pleading. Help us. Emma opened her eyes. The mirror before her wasn't just reflecting the room, it was reflecting her own face, but twisted and dark, like a shadow that had escaped from her body. The house was pulling at her again, trying to take her back, But Emma wouldn't let it. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to the mirror, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. The reflection of her hand seemed to ripple, as if the mirror itself were alive. But she didn't flinch. The shard was still embedded in the ground behind her, and she could feel its power throbbing, its pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. "Help us." Emma took a deep breath, focusing on the voices. She could feel them all, every lost soul, every victim the house had consumed. They were all crying out, desperate for release, desperate for freedom. She could feel their pain, their agony, their longing for the light, and that light was within her reach. The moment her hand touched the mirror, the world seemed to dissolve. The house, the power, the souls, it all swirled around her in a vortex of chaos. The air crackled with energy as the house screamed in fury, trying to pull her in. But Emma stood her ground, pushing through the darkness, focusing on the one thing that could break the curse: her heart. The house was inside her, but she could feel the difference now. The darkness was still there, but it was no longer consuming her. She could feel the light, the part of her that had survived, that had fought back against the shadows. That was the part of her that was going to win. With one final, powerful thought, she pushed. The mirror cracked, the walls shattered, the house screamed in one last terrible cry. When Emma opened her eyes again, she was standing in the ruins of the house, but it was different. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone. The choking presence of the house lifted. The shattered pieces of the mirror lay scattered around her, the remains of the ancient curse now reduced to dust. Emma could feel the energy inside her settling, quieting. The house was still there, but it was no longer a threat. The power that had once consumed her was now a part of her. But she was no longer a prisoner. She was its keeper, yes, but she had control now. The darkness would never claim anyone again. The wind whispered softly around her as the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, casting a warm glow over the wreckage. The spirits of the lost souls, the ones trapped by the house for so long, were free. Emma could feel their presence around her. Grateful, peaceful, she had done it. She had broken the curse, and now the house was just a memory. Weeks passed and Emma found herself in a new world, a world where the shadows of the house no longer haunted her. She had returned to her life, but she was different now, stronger, more grounded. But there was always something inside her, a lingering echo of the darkness, a reminder of what she had fought and what she had become. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, she heard a faint knock at the door. At first, she ignored it, but then a second knock. It was soft, insistent. She stood slowly, making her way to the door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment she hesitated. A strange feeling washed over her, like the calm before a storm. When she opened the door, there was no one there, but lying on the ground was a small piece of glass. The shard, her. Breath caught in her throat as she picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in her palm. And for a moment, the world seemed to pulse around her. The house, the mirror, the curse, it was all there. But this time, Emma was ready. She had a choice. The shard pulsed in Emma's hand, the familiar energy spreading through her like wildfire. For a moment, she felt like she was back at the house, the suffocating walls closing in on her, the whispers, the hunger. But it wasn't the same. She had taken control. She had freed the souls trapped by the curse. And yet, the shard in her hand seemed to beckon her, a silent call she couldn't ignore. She placed the shard on her coffee table, her fingers trembling slightly as she stepped back, watching the small piece of glass shimmer in the low light. It had been broken, shattered, yet it was still alive. With the power of the house, the power she had fought so hard to control, and now it was here, with her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. The shard, as if answering her, trembled slightly on the table. Emma could almost hear the house, its dark voice vibrating at the edges of her thoughts. It was a subtle thing, like the hum of an old machine, waiting for her to give in, to open the door. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the shard again. It was cold to the touch, but her skin tingled, an electric pulse running through her veins. The house was still with her. It was never truly gone. "You know you can never escape," the voice whispered, its tone familiar. It was Margaret's voice, the woman who had been consumed by the house before her. "We are one, Emma. The house is in you, always has been, always will be." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had thought she had won. She had thought the house was gone. But now she understood. It wasn't just the house she had to fight. It was the darkness inside herself. The piece of her soul that had been shaped by the curse, the power that had bound her to the house. She had taken control, yes, but there was always a price. And now that price was knocking at her door. Days passed, and Emma found herself unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shard called to her every night, a constant quiet hum that reverberated in the air, in the walls of her apartment, in her very bones. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't focus. Everywhere she looked, there was something familiar in the shadows, something dark and restless. The house, its presence was still there, lingering, and it was starting to awaken again. On the seventh night, Emma stood in front of the shard. Her mind felt hazy, as if she were losing control again. The shard pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, pulling her closer, filling her with that same sensation of power, of control. It felt right, even though she knew it was wrong. "You cannot escape," the voice came again, clearer now. It wasn't just Margaret. It was every soul the house had ever consumed, every lost spirit calling to her, urging her to let go, to embrace the darkness. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as her fingers brushed the shard once more. This time, the light from the shard flared, casting eerie shadows across her room. The walls seemed to stretch, to distort, as if the house was growing inside her apartment, rebuilding itself. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Emma's breath quickened as the familiar sensation of the house's power wrapped around her again. It was pulling her in, claiming her once more, but Emma couldn't let it. She wouldn't let it. With a sudden burst of strength, she yanked her hand away from the shard. The pulse of energy that radiated from it was nearly overwhelming. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to focus. She needed to destroy it. The house was not going to take her again. With shaking hands, she grabbed the shard and ran to the window. She could feel the house watching, waiting for her to make her move. It was alive again, hungry, and she had to stop it now. She opened the window and held the shard high, preparing to throw it into the darkness. But before she could, a voice stopped her, soft but insistent. "You can't destroy me, Emma." The voice wasn't Margaret's, it was her own. The same voice she had heard in her mind all along, the one that had warned her from the beginning. "You are me, and I am you." The voice was calm, powerful. "You can't escape your fate. We are bound together." The weight of those words sank in deep into her soul. She wasn't just a keeper of the house. She was the house. Chapter 46. Embracing the darkness. The air seemed to vibrate around Emma as she stood at the window, the shard heavy in her hand. The power inside her was undeniable. She could feel it swirling, churning within her, a force that had always been with her. The house was not some distant thing. It was part of her, inside her, always had been. But she didn't have to give in to it. Emma's grip tightened around the shard as a new determination flooded her veins. She wasn't going to let the house define her. She had a choice, and she was going to take it. "You don't have to do this," the voice in her mind whispered, softer now, pleading. "You can be free." She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging. at her lips. "Freedom?" she whispered back. "There is no freedom from what we are." The room around her seemed to flicker, and for a brief moment she saw the house again. The walls, the mirrors, the faces of the lost souls. They were all waiting for her to accept the darkness. But Emma refused. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She was the house now, but that didn't mean she had to succumb to its will. She could control it. She could use its power without losing herself. She had been the house's prisoner once. She would not be again. With one final, decisive motion, Emma threw the shard into the night. The house screamed in agony as the shard flew from her hand, disappearing into the void. The air around her shifted, and Emma felt the power in her body begin to settle. The house, its presence, its hunger, it faded. Not completely, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it had been before. Emma stood at the window, watching the last remnants of the darkness dissolve into the night. The moon shone brightly in the sky, casting a soft light over the world below. She had done it. She had broken the curse, and now she was free. For the first time in her life, Emma felt at peace. The house, its power, its influence, was no longer a part of her. She had freed herself, and in doing so, she had freed the house from its endless cycle of darkness. As the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, Emma smiled. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape.